Behind every bit of mom wisdom is a story of a real mom and real kids just trying to love each other well. Whether you're cozied up on the couch with a mug of coffee or out for a walk, you're welcome to join us as we share stories and laugh, learn, and grow together. It's the iMOM podcast. Welcome to this week's episode of the iMOM podcast. I'm Abby. Susan and Megan are here, and this week we have a guest. He's a writer, he's a speaker, and a father of four, and he's the founder of For Us Marriage, Ted Lowe. Hello, Ted.
Hey, friends. How are you guys?
We're good.
I'm a little terrified.
We're so glad
right
you're
now.
here.
Yeah, but the question is, are people listening glad I'm here? Like they're driving around trying to listen to a mom podcast and some dude starts talking. They're going to feel betrayed.
Yeah. How are you feeling about being on with three ladies?
Well, it doesn't seem like a fair fight, first of all, but no. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
Well, we're not here to fight.
No, and you have all the expertise, so we're feeling at a disadvantage.
I don't know about that, but yeah, we'll just all do the best we can. How about that?
So actually, fighting is the topic of today's episode. Conflict, not how to avoid it completely, because obviously, we're humans and we are married to people who are not us. And so conflict is bound to happen. But instead of avoiding conflict, Ted is going to talk to us today about things we can do, things that we can avoid when we're in the middle of conflict. Are you ready for that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm on the edge of my seat because, 30 some years of marriage and I still haven't figured it out. So if you can fix this one, Ted, you're going to be my favorite author ever.
Well, and I love that it's from a male perspective. Do you think this conversation would be the same, or that your points would be the same, or tips if you were sitting with three males, three husbands?
We might talk about it a little differently, but it's still the same information. It still applies to both. So I don't think what we're talking about today is gender specific. I think it applies to both. But yeah, we would probably have a different type of conversation.
and I will say this: I have heard Ted speak many times at different things that we've had at Family First. And if you're a lady sitting out there and you have a husband who you've never been able to get him to kind of watch or listen to Marriage Chef, Ted is your guy, because he does it in a way that's really relevant, very funny, and very clear. So my favorite.
Well, one
sure.
of the things that my husband loves about how the way Ted talks is TED Talks.
TED Talks.
Is he's very disarming. Like it's
Yes.
not a you're doing this wrong and
Right.
you're doing this wrong. It's very here's just some solutions on how to work on it in your marriage.
I love that.
glad
So now
you
we
heard
made
that.
you feel good.
Okay, good.
There you go.
Build him up, knock him down. Here we
Yeah,
go.
we're luring you in.
Is this the Oreo cookie
so-
part? Okay, I got you. This is the stuffing. All right, I'm ready. Locked in.
All right. So again, this isn't about avoiding fights. It's about avoiding silly fights and like ways that we can do that. So can you give us an example, Ted, of a silly fight that you've gotten into with your wife?
Oh, wow. There's so many. But the one that comes to mind was, and we share this a good bit because I think it just communicates what we say is that silly fights can cause serious damage. But my wife does not like doing yard work at all, in which I'm going fine because I don't mind it. Our yard's a little bit bigger than most. And so I'll spend time out there and I don't mind it. She comes out, it's really hot. We live in Georgia, and she says, "Hey, I'm going to help. What can I do to help?" And wasn't super excited about the help, but I appreciated the heart of it. So I handed her a weed eater and I go about my business. I look and she's weed eating a section that obviously needs to be mowed in my interpretation. But I'm like, she really doesn't do that. That's going to take her forever and it'll take me 2 seconds. I look at her and so I start waving my arms. Hey, you don't have to do that. You don't do that. Of course, there's all the noise going on with the weed eater and the lawnmower. My girl takes the weed eater, slams it down on the ground and marches in the house. And I'm like, what is that all about? And so I go, and we got into this whole thing about a weed eater. And so she thought, this is one of those, she thought that I was being frustrated with her. And what I was trying to do is like, you don't need to do this. I was feeling bad. She was out there anyway. She thought I was bossing her around. And then I'm looking at her seeing frustrated. So it just turned into this silly thing that it was just misinformation, right? We've all been there. We have these fights and we're like, wow, where did that come from? And I think we don't share our silly fights because when we say them out loud, they seem silly. So we keep them to ourselves, but they're important.
I think that's really smart. Like the things that happen in these silly fights are indicators of maybe other things that we're doing that might be causing bigger fights.
Totally.
My silly fights often happen in the car, like when we're looking for parking spots, or like I think he's going to go to that parking spot. Then he goes by it or goes the other direction. I'm like, what about that spot? Right, what about the one right there?
Let me just stop you right there, Abby. Men, we used to be able to kill bears and lions and tigers and please let us conquer the parking spot all by ourselves. We have so little to look forward to. It is a thing, like if she tells me that one, there's part of my soul that goes, it will never be that one because I am going to find a different one. So those are those things you're going, this is silly. I'm going to let it go, man. Mm-hmm. You may never understand that, but it's true.
So mine kind of builds on that because Mark and I both work. So, we both have to do things at home to get the jobs done. But when he does things, he keeps a record and has to report to me. Well, so far today, I've done this and I've done this and I've done this and I've done this. And if any of those happen to be things that I normally do, like unload the dishwasher or whatever, I'm supposed to, do a 3-part cheer and a split and a herky jump, or something. I don't know. But then I always kind of get frustrated, like, okay, yeah. And I did this, and this, like, what are you trying? Why does he want? And then it gets in a fight and he says, I don't appreciate him. I said, no, you want applause for your daily jobs. I do that too. Mm-hmm. What is that about?
Well, and every man does it, take out the trash. Don't worry about it. I got it. Don't you go thinking about the trash because I am the trash guy. And so it is a big deal.
But we have to praise them for it, even though it's like a daily thing.
I get it. I get it why that would be annoying. I think there's little things that your husband's going to do. And it's like, is that a battle that I choose? Like, is that something I want to talk about? Maybe. And if that's important to go, hey, I don't feel valued. You have that conversation. I usually say couples only fight about things when they're in the middle of those things. And their bodies and their brains are not set up to talk about it. So they only talk about chores and who's doing the most in the middle of chores, or they'll only talk about finances when one of them does it the wrong way. They'll only talk about parenting when they feel like their spouse is doing it the right way. So bodies and brains are triggered. Take a breath. If those things are important, talk about them later when everybody's kind of calm with a different spirit, not a spirit of frustration or anger or are you kidding me, but a spirit of wanting to connect because that's what we want. Like that's it. Right now, hopefully people are not necessarily triggered with their husband. It's just to pull back and go, hey, I want this to be really good. And it's something silly and I'm just going to let it go. I'm sure that I have a little silly something that they let go every day, but they're not brave enough to tell me.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to change them. I think I just need to kiss them and go, oh, you are the best.
That dishwasher is so empty right now.
It's so empty right now.
Well, I think you bring up a great point, Ted, because one of the things that we've talked about on the podcast, it's kind of a reoccurring theme, is this idea of the invisible burden that moms are kind of juggling and just juggling 20 million things at once. And I was thinking back to, it was literally like last weekend, and I was inside with our kids doing laundry, unloading the dishwasher and cooking dinner. And I look outside and my sweet husband is hand fertilizing the grass. And I zoomed in and sent a video to my friends and I was like, guys, he's hand feeding the lawn and I am in here doing 20,000 things and I'm about to murder him.
He was taking good care of the lawn.
But it does seem so silly when I say it out loud because it's just logistics. It's just logistics going back and forth.
So what's one of the 4 things we should avoid when we are in these type of fights? Or they're building. How about, what should we avoid before we even get started?
Right. I think it's the interpretation. Like we started interpreting like what's going on. Like she interpreted that I was frustrated with her. And there's just the interpretation that now you're dealing with and talking about something you've interpreted that's not even there. And so it becomes very confusing, like what's going on. And so people get real defensive. Like if you bring someone something that you've interpreted that may or may not be true, now you're on the defense going, wait a minute. What do you mean I was frustrated with you? I wasn't frustrated with you. It's hot out here. I didn't want you to have to mow that part of that or weed eat that part of that because I was going to do that. So just don't think of yourself as a professional interpreter. You're not. at the end of the day. And that is a recipe for so much frustration on both sides.
Yeah. So I need to kind of interpret, Mark just needs praise instead of interpreting it like, I do those dishes every day and he never says one word. Why should why do I have to praise him? He just needs it. He just needs it. So what's the big deal?
Well, it's almost like getting defensive.
Right.
Because you're like, okay, you just told me everything you did. Let me show you everything I did.
Yeah.
It's like a competition or something.
Yeah.
I think about interpretation, like thinking about it the other way. If it's misinterpretation, if you are misinterpreting a language, you're hearing the words wrong or you're not understanding what they're saying. And that happens to us a lot. Kind of like what happened with you and your wife. Sometimes I'll say to my husband, why are you angry right now? Because he has like an intensity to his voice. So it's almost like the language that he's speaking, I'm not understanding it the right way. And he says, no, he's not angry. He's just communicating. So what do you do if your husband's intensity or style of communication makes it more likely that you would misinterpret what he's saying?
Yeah. And that's a tough one, Abby. I know sometimes, that's not a problem to be solved, but attention to be managed. Maybe not responding immediately after you feel like that was intense. Or the side going, wow, you say you're not angry. It's coming off angry to me. And at the same time, how much do you want to believe that that's true with him? Because as men, we are taught you speak boldly and bravely and with intensity. I'll never forget my oldest son when he was about 15. He came, heard me speak, and he goes, I don't like to hear you speak because you sound like you do when you're getting on to me. And I said,
that's interesting.
Well, first of all, I'm highly insulted and it breaks my heart. Okay. Second of all, I told him, hey, that's my passion voice. That's my I care about you voice. And I said, so I care about as much as you as I do an entire audience worth of people. But I think there's a thing with men where, we can be intense. And I tell guys all the time, remember, you're bigger, larger, and more intimidating. Don't use that to your advantage. At the same time, men talk a lot of times way differently than women.
When I think about interpretation, Ted, I also think that it kind of involves you reading the other person's mind or assuming that you know what they're thinking. Are interpretation and mind reading the same thing?
They're pretty similar. I think sometimes interpretation to some degree can be a little bit helpful. You can interpret, they've had a tough day, or they can interpret, hey, they're a little frustrated right now. The mind reading part, we have almost zero ability to read someone else's mind. Sometimes, Nancy, my wife, she'll get going and I'll go, hey, she'll say, what? I go, you're having a whole conversation that I'm not a part of. And she'll start responding off of things that I'm not saying. I'm like, wait, I would never say that. So I think there's those you can't read minds. And that's going to, when I realized that just on so many levels, that'll set you free because you start thinking about, they're really thinking this. They said this, but what they really meant was this. That's a dangerous thing to play. And again, you're bringing someone something that's just not true. And, I say all the time, the only one that has the ability to read minds is God, and neither spouse is God.
I deal with that for sure in my marriage. And I think that I try to give my husband the benefit of the doubt. That's how I work through that. Because I will have 3 fights with him before he's even involved in the fight, So we've actually said those words will you give me the benefit of the doubt next time? Because I think that we jump to something that's just not true and not real. And instead, if we assume the best about our spouse, then usually we avoid that internal fight that we're having.
That's right. And that's one of the things that research they have found with happy couples that they do is they see the best. They give their spouse the most generous explanation for the behavior, and then they believe it. And so they're able to have the ability to focus on what they do love and focus less on what they don't. And so that's it's the gift that we want them to give us back and almost expect them to give us back, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hard. I struggle with that for sure.
Well, and it's hard to, after you've been together for so long and you know each other's quirks and kind of blind spots, and it's a repeated pattern. And so when it happens again and again, you're kind of looking for it to happen then, and you're less willing to give them the benefit of a doubt because it's a repeated pattern. But I think to your point, your spouse is the closest person to you if we can try to do that as often as we can.
Well, and you want to believe that you're both growing and changing for the better. All right. So interpretation, mind reading, what is another thing to avoid when we're in silly fights?
I don't know about you guys, but you can especially when we were first married, I'd play this comparison game. They'd come in late and like, you're late. We said we're going to leave, right now. And they're like, well, last week you were late, or you were always so frustrated with me. You're the one that's always frustrated about X, Y, Z. And no one ever goes, you know what? My crime is worse than your crime, which makes your crime not. I mean, it's this weird game that if you'll hear kids playing with each other, you'll hear your kids saying that. And so it's just this childish game that we're like, and we feel so offended. And sometimes here's the tough part. Sometimes the comparison is fair, or it makes more sense. Like, you're complaining that I was 5 minutes late when you're married to someone perpetually late. So those get kind of weird. But again, those are the conversations that you have a little bit later, so it can be constructive and say, okay, what am I really feeling here? Am I frustrated you're late, or am I hurt that I feel devalued? I think it's those questions that get a little bit deeper when you do actually talk about it, and talk about it with a spirit of connection versus of being defensive.
Yeah. And one thing that I struggle with, because I have heard that tip before of save it for later, like don't explode in the moment. Don't try to hash it out if you're right in the middle of something that needs to get done or whatever it might be. I have found a difficulty with having little kids is like, by the time we get them into bed and like get everything wrapped up and the day's done, we're like too tired to sit down and have like a true constructive conversation about that. So do you have any tips or advice or anything? Is it that we need to go ahead and just take the time and talk about it then, or find a time when we're not exhausted and it's just going to get even worse because we're tired and then we're talking about it?
That's a great question. I think sometimes delaying things too, sometimes it'll just knock it off the list. You go, right. I was frustrated then, so I don't need to talk about this. But I think the principle holds true. If like you guys are exhausted at the end of the day, that's not a great time to talk about it. I think there's some personalities that want to talk about it right away. And so they have a more sense of urgency. Like my oldest son, he'll say, I want to talk about it right now. And I'm like, no, you don't. You think that you do, but you don't. But I think it's for Megan, for that is to go, when is that time where you are both relaxed and that you can talk about it, that you're in a good space? I mean, we had someone that tell us in premarital, don't talk about anything important before 9 a.m. and after 9 p.m. And when we've broken that rule, because she's a morning person and I'm a nighttime person, and it's like, we started walking early during COVID. And I'm like, by the time I get home, I was a wreck. I'm like, she's talking about all the things. I'm like, I don't want to walk with you anymore. So I think when is that time that it is good, and give yourself a break. And it's only got to work for the two of you, right? Like when is that time for the two of you that you go, we talk well here.
Yeah. And not on a date when you're trying to have fun.
Yeah. Well, but I love the 9 a.m., 9 p.m. That's a good tip. Good practical tip.
Talking about comparison, Ted, what would you say if, like, to a woman who feels like her husband doesn't hold himself to the same standard that he holds her? For example, if he complains about, her going out with friends for brunch or something like that, yet he has a golf hobby and he's out for 4 hours every other Saturday, it's hard to not compare when you feel like maybe you're being held to a different standard.
That's right. I think when those things, you've got to talk about those things, right? We understand to wait and delay. I think it's how you talk about that, and not talking about it in a tone of comparison, but to say, hey, listen, I feel whatever your feel word is at that moment. Like, I don't know if you're meaning to do this, but when I think about I'm with the kids and I go out for dinner, but yet you're playing golf and you tell me, can you help me understand, like, how's that different? Like, how do you see that? And me kind of going into it with understanding and not going in like, hey, I'm having to tiptoe around, but it's the same way. Approach is a good thing. It's the same way to reverse, right? The way you want them to approach you.
I love saying, how do you see that? Because normally we would tell them how we think they see it.
Yeah.
Or how we see it.
Yeah. I mean, because he may go, oh, I'm doing business out on the golf course. I mean, that's the world's oldest excuse. But right? You're going, well, I'm doing business. I am trying to survive over here as the CEO of these children. And I need some time to talk to my business partners over here because it's crazy days. But yeah, it is like, where are you coming from? Because you may see something that he doesn't.
You may say this is a terrible thing to do, but I've had to do this. Maybe it's because I'm a data person, but we had this issue where it was in the comparison, you always do this and you never do this. There's these extremes. And I finally had to say at one point, okay, I always do this. Okay, let's start writing it down. And sometimes feeling versus reality is different. Like, do I always go out? No, let's write this down and let's just, make sure we're having balance and not write it down to prove, but write it down to create balance. I think it's the motive of the heart. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Help me understand. Yeah. Records. Those are a little frightening for me to bust out the records of what's going on. But Susan, if that works, I just gotta, but I get what you're saying to say, wait a minute, this is just not reality. Sometimes you have feelers, mirror thinkers, and they'll say, or they got maximizers, will marry minimizers. Everything's a big deal. So you bring up a great point. I think that's something not to bring in a fight either, is the always never words, because wow, I'm always late, or I'm never help you with the kids, or I always. To say somebody's always in something in the category is big words. And those are just things, decision. And what I'd say to couples all the time is going, don't beat yourself up that you don't know how to do this. Who taught us this? Nobody taught us this. Just like no one teaches us, I think that's why I'm so passionate on the podcast for All Pro Dad and, iMOM and all the materials and all the different things that we do is we're going, because no one else has taught us. But just give yourself and your spouse some grace.
Do we tell people that Ted is actually the host of our All Pro Dad podcast?
We are.
We do have a good time. And the conversations, I don't know, they're not as different than I thought they were. So yeah, maybe we do have the exact same conversation.
Were you nervous about being with us today?
I'm better. I'm okay. I've settled in. Good.
He's a good boy.
All right,
You'll come back.
We got one more chance for you to really panic and crumble, Ted. So interpretation, mind reading, comparison. What is another thing that we should avoid in fights?
Threats. Threats are a no-go. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. It's the threat. If you do A, then I'm going to do B. That is parenting at its worst even. It's just not marriage. And so it's not a threat. Don't threaten and say, okay, you can go ahead and be out with your friends, but I'll tell you what you're going to come home to. You're going to come home to a very mad person. You go ahead and do that and watch me, that kind of stuff.
Why not? What does that cause? Like, what does that make him do? If you issue that threat of, okay, go ahead, but I'm going to be mad when you get home. What do you think that does to the husband?
Well, I think whether it's the husband or the wife, none of us want to be threatened by anybody, especially by our person. So I think sometimes we get so caught up in marriage, we can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes I think it's helpful. Let's pull it into any other relationship. Would you have a best friend that use threats to in your relationship? No, you'd find a new best friend. And so I think it's a thing, but to answer your question, I think it doesn't draw him near to you. If he did the same, it wouldn't draw you to him. So I think it's just a thing of just stay away from that one. Like some of this thing we got to figure out, but threats we don't. It's just a no-go.
I think it escalates it. And it also builds mistrust. Because if you're threatening me, this is supposed to be the person you feel closest to and you trust the most. You're in a marriage together. And that just makes me feel like I can't trust you. So I agree. That's probably the biggest of the four that you got to avoid.
I almost feel like I'm trying to think back, but I feel like it would make the person fearful.
Right.
Because then it's like, are you actually going to do that? Or is it an empty threat? Is it a real threat? I don't know. I don't know if I want to find out.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I've watched Nancy and I, we've had to learn this over the years. And that's one of the reasons we love doing what we do is like, we felt we had to learn everything the hard way, right? Like some of this stuff is like things that we've learned that we didn't do well. But what I've learned is when she will say to me, like, and instead of being angry at me, she goes, wow, that just really hurt my feelings. It breaks my heart. I'm so sorry. If she gets on the list of what I did wrong, even that whole idea of a threat, just go, wow, that really hurt my feelings. And that is I'm going to need a second. So I think saying those things are clear. Even if he's very logical, linear thinking, you give him a little bit about that. You can give him details of going, wait, I feel like I'm doing a lot of stuff around the house. And when you say that, I feel devalued. That hurt my feelings. I mean, just watching her, seeing her vulnerable in that way, I can own more of my behavior than when she's defensive.
Mm-hmm. I think that's powerful just to be more honest about the hurt that it caused, instead of anger is just that surface emotion oftentimes, and there's something else a lot deeper. Any final questions for Ted from the ladies? This is like our free counseling session. So
I know,
live it up,
super
girls.
helpful.
No, we're just happy Ted works with us because, ladies, we got to confess, we get to talk to him whenever we want. So,
Yeah. Well, what was the episode that we did a little bit ago? It just dropped, and it was like how you should be treating your, and the four of us were a mess. I was like, we need to have Ted on.
How to love your husband better. And we were all just like, wow, we are not good at this.
yes, yeah.
So Ted, we need to have Ted reoccurring maybe every couple months.
And if you want your husband to hear Ted every week, he does host the All Pro Dad podcast.
Yep.
And it's great.
So Ted, then one last question. If we do these things in a fight, if we misinterpret, if we mind read, if we compare, if we threaten, what is the best way for us to repair or to get out of that fight without damage being done?
That's a great question. Some of the research shows that one of the most powerful tools that couples have when it comes to conflict, the couples that report the highest level of marital satisfaction have a thing called a repair attempt. And a repair attempt is defined as anything, word or action, that delays and slows down conflict. So I watched a movie the other day, and they're kind of in the fight, and the wife stops and she goes, hold on, let's remember we love each other. Or sometimes it's even I need a second. Or, hey, let's do this again. Like, I want to do this when we can talk about this better. We're not talking about this right now. And so I think it's just slowing things down. And it's really hard to do that because when you're triggered, you're not in the logical part of your brain. So triggers get escalated more and more and more. So to give yourself, and it's amazing just taking a really deep breath, what that'll do. The breath is a huge thing. I have never regretted a moment as a dad or as a husband when I paused, right? I've got many regrets when I didn't, but when I just pause, it makes all the difference. So give yourself some space.
I love that. Yeah. Ted, we want to thank you for being here and chatting with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. You guys weren't nearly as scary as I thought this was going to be. So I appreciate it.
Good to know.
Good. I'll put a link to all of Ted's socials if you want to book Ted to come and speak at your church or to your group. And also a link to the All Pro Dad podcast in our show notes. And thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the iMOM podcast. iMOM is the motherhood program of the nonprofit organization Family First. Along with our fatherhood program, All Pro Dad, we exist to help you love your family well. Subscribe to our daily email, the iMOM Minute, by going to imom.com/subscribe and get tons of great ideas, insight, and inspiration. The iMOM podcast is hosted by me, Abby Watts, along with Susan Merrill, Megan Tigner, and Chloe Blumenthal.